The job offer came at the perfect time. My landlord had given me a week to come up with rent or face eviction, and my dwindling bank account wasn't going to last another day. I was scrolling through an endless stream of online ads when I found it. Night guard needed. Immediate start. No experience required. $25 per hour. The pay seemed too good to be true, but I was desperate. The mall, Westview Galleria, wasn't far from my apartment, and I remembered going there as a kid. It used to be lively, packed with shoppers and decked out during the holidays. These days, though, it felt more like a ghost town. Most of the stores had closed, leaving only a few big-name outlets and a food court that was barely operational. I didn't care about the state of the place, I just needed the money. I arrived 15 minutes early for my interview, dressed in my best attempt at professional attire. A wrinkled button-down and jeans that hadn't been through the wash in a week. The mall's main entrance was locked, but a man in a dark gray uniform emerged from a side door and waved me over. He introduced himself as Greg, the head of security, though his slouched posture and bloodshot eyes didn't inspire much confidence. "You're Daniel, right?" he asked, lighting a cigarette before I could even answer. "Good. You're hired. Start tonight." There was no formal interview, no questions about my background, just a clipboard with a contract to sign and a terse set of instructions. Felt odd, but again, I didn't have the luxury of being picky. That night, I returned at 10:45 p.m. for my first shift. Greg handed me a security badge, a flashlight, and a crumpled piece of paper with the rules. His tone was flat, almost rehearsed, as he rattled them off. "Follow these to the letter," he said, jabbing the paper with a nicotine-stained finger. "Don't get curious, don't test anything, and whatever happens, don't quit mid-shift." "Got it," I nodded, feeling the weight of his words even though I didn't fully understand them yet. After a brief, unnerving silence, Greg muttered, "Good luck," and walked out, leaving me alone in the dimly lit security office. I unfolded the paper and read the rules carefully, my skepticism mounting with each one. They were oddly specific, borderline superstitious, but there was something unsettling about the way they were worded, like they'd been written by someone who had learned these lessons the hard way. Rule 1. Always start your shift by walking the length of the food court twice. If you hear footsteps behind you, do not turn around or stop. Just continue walking until the sound disappears. Rule 2. Between 1:15 a.m. and 1:25 a.m., go to the jewelry store in the northwest wing and knock on the glass display case 3 times. If you see a reflection of someone who isn't you, apologize aloud and leave immediately. Rule 3. If you find a mannequin that wasn't there before, reposition it to face the nearest wall and avoid looking directly at its face. If you accidentally meet its eyes, find a reflective surface and stare into it for 10 seconds to break the gaze. Rule 4. Under no circumstances should you respond to the sound of a baby crying in the mall after 2 a.m. If you hear it, go to the nearest security camera monitor and watch until it stops. If it doesn't, press the red button on the console. Rule 5. Do not enter the electronics store between 3 a.m. and 3:10 a.m., even if you hear music or see lights coming from it. If the store door is open during this time, lock it and avoid looking inside. Rule 6. At 4:45 a.m., go to the main entrance and ensure all doors are locked. If you see a man in a maintenance uniform standing outside, wave to him but do not open the door. If he knocks, ignore it no matter how persistent he is. Rule 7. If you hear someone whispering your name, check the time. If it's an even-numbered hour, say, "I am not who you think I am," and keep walking. If it's an odd-numbered hour, find the nearest storage closet, lock yourself in, and wait 5 minutes before emerging. Rule 8. Do not stay in one place for more than 15 minutes. The longer you linger, the more likely it is to find you. If you feel a chill or sense you're being watched, change locations immediately. Rule 9. End your shift by returning to the food court and sitting in the same seat you started in. Leave exactly when the clock strikes 6 a.m. Do not leave early or late. If the mall feels different as you leave, walk straight to your car without looking back, no matter what you hear. I read through the list twice, the ridiculousness of it making me chuckle nervously. Was this some kind of hazing ritual? Still, something about Greg's demeanor stuck with me. He didn't seem like the type to joke. For now, I decided to treat the rules like company policy and follow them, no matter how absurd they seemed. After all, I needed the paycheck. My shift officially started at 11 p.m., so I clipped the flashlight to my belt and set out for the food court. The mall was unnervingly quiet, the kind of silence that made your own footsteps sound deafening. I walked the length of the food court twice as instructed, feeling silly but relieved when nothing out of the ordinary happened. That is, until I finished the second lap. As I was heading back toward the security office, I heard it. Soft, deliberate footsteps trailing behind me. My pulse quickened as the rules flashed in my mind. Don't turn around. Don't stop. I kept walking, trying to maintain an even pace, but the sound grew louder, closer, until it was almost in sync with my own steps. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. I reached the safety of the security office, my heart pounding, but I shrugged it off as nerves. Surely I'd imagined it. The hours crept by, and the mall's unsettling atmosphere only grew heavier. At 1:15 a.m., I made my way to the northwest wing, flashlight in hand. The jewelry store was exactly where the map in the office had said it would be, its dimly lit display cases casting faint reflections. I knocked 3 times on the glass, feeling utterly ridiculous, but then something in the reflection caught my eye. There was a figure standing behind me, tall, gaunt, and dressed in black, its face obscured by shadow. My breath hitched, and I remembered the rule. Apologize aloud and leave immediately. I'm sorry, I stammered, backing away from the glass. When I turned, there was nothing there, but the feeling of being watched lingered, crawling under my skin. Shaking off the encounter at the jewelry store wasn't easy, but I forced myself to focus on the rules. If this was some elaborate prank, I wasn't about to lose the job over it. I spent the next hour wandering the mall, keeping an eye on the time and staying in motion as Rule 8 required. It was eerie how the mall seemed to hum with life even in its emptiness. The mannequins in the store windows took on an unnerving quality in the dim light, and every creak of the metal vents above made me flinch. When 2 a.m. rolled around, I found myself walking near the eastern wing, which housed a few clothing outlets and an abandoned arcade. That's when I heard it, a faint, high-pitched wail echoing through the corridors, a baby crying. My stomach turned cold as I remembered Rule 4, do not respond. The sound was distant at first, almost like it was coming from the far end of the wing, but as I stood frozen, it grew louder, more insistent. The cry was sharp, pained, and completely out of place in this desolate space. I wanted to believe it was a recording, a trick to scare me, but there was something disturbingly raw about the noise. I forced myself to walk toward the nearest camera monitor, my footsteps echoing louder than they should have. The monitor was embedded in the wall of a small alcove near the food court, and as I stared at the grainy screen, the crying grew louder, sharper, as though the source were moving closer. The screen showed nothing but static for a moment before flickering to life. The grainy image of the eastern wing appeared, and there it was, a stroller sitting in the middle of the corridor. No baby, just the stroller, facing directly toward the camera. The crying abruptly stopped, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. My breath caught, and my eyes darted to the console's red button. I hesitated, unsure if pressing it would make things worse. The stroller remained motionless on the monitor, but as I stared, something shifted in the background. A shadow, humanoid but wrong. Its limbs were twisted all along its entire body, as if tangled. While it crept along the far wall, I waited no longer and I slammed the red button with trembling fingers. The screen went black, and the console emitted a low beep before powering off. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I grabbed my flashlight and moved as far from the eastern wing as I could. By 3 a.m., I was nearing the electronics store. Its glass doors were shut, the inside dark and still. I almost sighed in relief until I heard faint music. It was the jingle of a commercial, warped and slow, playing somewhere inside the store. Then the lights flickered on, one by one, illuminating rows of televisions and sound systems. The doors creaked open, inviting me in. Every instinct screamed at me to turn away, but the rule was clear. Lock the door and avoid looking inside. My hands trembled as I reached for the keyring on my belt. As I slid the key into the lock, the music inside grew louder, the warped voices repeating some incomprehensible phrase. I focused on the task, refusing to look up, but just as I turned the key, a voice called out from inside, muffled and urgent. "Help me," it pleaded. "Please, it's in here with me." I froze, my grip tightening on the door handle. The voice sounded real, desperate, but I couldn't break the rule. My chest tightened as the plea turned into a scream, raw, agonized, and echoing in my ears. I turned the key, securing the lock, and stepped back. The lights inside the store flickered again, and for a brief moment, I caught a glimpse of something through the glass. A shape, tall and skeletal, with glowing, hollow eyes. Its head snapped toward me, and I stumbled backward, nearly dropping my flashlight. I didn't wait to see if it moved. I ran. The next hour passed in a haze of paranoia and dread. Every shadow seemed to stretch toward me, and every distant creak felt like a warning. At 4:45 a.m., I made my way to the main entrance to ensure all the doors were locked. The moment I approached, I spotted him. A man in a maintenance uniform standing outside, his face obscured by the glare of the overhead lights. He waved at me, a slow, deliberate motion that made my skin crawl. My hand twitched toward the door handle, but I stopped myself. Rule 6, wave back, but do not open the door. I lifted my hand in an awkward wave, and the man responded with a smile that I could just barely make out through the glass. It was wrong, stretched too wide, like his face couldn't quite contain it. Then he knocked, 3 sharp raps that echoed through the empty mall. I stepped back, my heart racing, as he knocked again, harder this time. "Let me in," he said, his voice muffled but firm. "I need to check the locks." I shook my head, retreating farther into the corridor. The knocking grew more frantic, his voice rising into a shout. "Open the door, now!" he bellowed, slamming his fists against the glass. I turned and fled, the sound of his pounding following me until I was out of earshot. My legs felt like lead, but I forced myself to keep moving, knowing I couldn't stop for long. I sprinted away from the entrance, my heart hammering in my chest as the echo of the man's pounding fists faded behind me. The mall's silence felt heavier than before, a suffocating weight that made every creak and shuffle of my footsteps unbearably loud. The corridors seemed darker now, as though the dim security lights were giving up their struggle to push back the gloom. My watch read 4:50 a.m., but I couldn't shake the feeling that time itself had slowed, stretching every second into an eternity. Rule 8 was gnawing at the back of my mind. I couldn't linger in one place for too long. Yet, my body was screaming for rest. My legs burned, my lungs ached, but stopping felt more dangerous than running. The next corridor took me past a line of mannequins displayed in the windows of a clothing store. I froze mid-step. There were 3 mannequins facing forward, their stiff poses illuminated in the faint light. My stomach sank because I distinctly remembered passing this store earlier and seeing only 2. The third mannequin stood slightly apart from the others, its head tilted ever so slightly to the side. I couldn't see its face clearly, but something about its proportions was wrong. Its arms were too long, its fingers unnaturally tapered. Rule 3 snapped into my mind. I had to reposition it to face the nearest wall. Every step toward the window felt like a march to my doom. My reflection in the glass was pale, my eyes wide with fear, but the mannequin's face was turned just enough that I couldn't make out its features. The sensation of being watched clawed at my nerves as I opened the door to the store and stepped inside. The air was colder here, almost biting. Slowly, I approached the mannequin, careful to avoid its face. Its body was unervingly detailed, every wrinkle in its skin, every fold in its clothes meticulously crafted. My fingers shook as I gripped its shoulders and turned it toward the wall. Its head shifted slightly with the motion, as though it were resisting. I shut my eyes tight and turned away, backing toward the door. Then I heard it, a faint scrape like fabric brushing against something solid. My stomach twisted into knots as I forced myself to glance back. The other 2 mannequins had turned their heads to face me. My pulse spiked, and I nearly bolted out of the store, but I stopped myself just short of running. My gaze darted to the nearest reflective surface, a small mirror mounted on the store counter. I stared into it, counting each agonizing second. My breath fogged the glass as my trembling hands gripped the counter. A shadow moved behind me in the reflection. I couldn't tell if it was the mannequin or something else. My own reflection seemed to shift unnaturally, its movements lagging behind mine. I turned away from the mirror, refusing to look back at the mannequins, and sprinted out of the store. I stumbled into the central atrium, my watch showing 5:15 a.m. The rules were clear. I couldn't stop moving, not even for a moment. That's when I heard my name being whispered, curling around my name like a trap. Marcus? It hissed, sending a wave of cold through my veins. My breath hitched, and my eyes frantically darted to the security camera monitor mounted above the hallway. It was 5:32 a.m. I froze, a knot tightening in my stomach. It was an odd-numbered hour. I didn't have to think twice. I bolted toward the nearest storage closet, the low hum of the fluorescent lights overhead adding to the suffocating silence around me. My footsteps echoed in the empty mall, but they sounded wrong, like they were being followed by something else, something that wasn't mine. Reaching the door, I slammed it shut behind me, locking it with shaking hands. My heart was pounding in my ears, louder than ever. The silence inside the closet was almost unbearable. The only sound my rapid breathing and the faint, distant hum of the mall's air conditioning. I stood perfectly still, pressing myself against the back wall, eyes trained on the small window in the door. The minutes seemed to stretch into eternity, each second hanging in the air like a threat. My mind kept racing, replaying every terrifying event from the night. The knocking on the glass door, the man in the maintenance uniform, the whispering voice. What had I gotten myself into? Suddenly, there was a noise outside the closet, a faint shuffle. It wasn't like the distant footfalls I'd heard earlier. This was closer, deliberate. Someone or something was moving just outside. I held my breath, straining to hear. The sound stopped, and for a moment, there was nothing. Then, the unmistakable scrape of something sliding across the floor. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I couldn't stay locked in here forever. The rules had made that clear. I had to survive, I had to keep moving. But how could I leave when something was right outside? Another scrape, closer this time. I glanced at the clock on my phone. It had been 5 minutes. I had to leave, but I couldn't. Every instinct in me screamed that it wasn't safe. The whispering voice, the footsteps that hadn't stopped. They were getting closer, drawing nearer with every passing second. My chest tightened as the door handle rattled. I wasn't alone anymore. I pulled out my phone from my pocket, expecting the time to be 6 a.m., so I could escape this hell of a place without further consequences. It was 5:37 a.m. I felt like I was about to vomit when I found out I couldn't leave yet, but I realized the sounds have stopped and 5 minutes have gone by. Better than being found, I thought. I cautiously left the area, doing extra checks so time can go by quicker, but I thought about hiding in a closet until it was the end of my shift. It was 5:58 a.m. now. I felt so relieved, but as I made my way to the food court and sat in my seat, the air outside felt different. The usual buzz of the fluorescent lights had vanished, replaced with an unsettling silence that seemed to echo in the empty hallways. The store displays were still lifeless. I couldn't hear the usual hum of the mall's ventilation, the clatter of distant footsteps or the murmur of workers. It was as if the entire world had gone silent, waiting for something to happen. I took a cautious step out, my feet making no sound against the cold tile floor. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, something waiting for me to make one wrong move. My pulse quickened, but I kept walking, my steps slow and deliberate, just as I had done earlier. The food court was at the far end of the hall, and it felt like the longest walk I had ever made. I had to get to my seat. I had to sit there. When I finally reached the food court, I saw the seat I had started in. It was empty now, just as I had left it. I sat down, my legs weak beneath me, my hands still trembling in my lap. The clock on the wall ticked, the second hand moving like it had a mind of its own. I felt it now, a strange stillness that made the air feel thick, heavy. I couldn't explain it, but something had changed. The mall no longer felt like a place of work, of routine. It felt alien, like something had shifted just out of sight. I glanced around, but everything was still, eerily so. The windows were dark now, the last vestiges of daylight fading as the early morning light began to creep in. The mall, once familiar, was now a place of shadows, a place where the rules didn't make sense anymore. It was then that I realized I was no longer alone. The feeling of being watched was stronger now, but not from behind, not from the corners of the food court. No, this time it came from above. I slowly lifted my eyes to the ceiling, and that's when I saw it. The lights, they were no longer flickering. They were dimmed, too low, like someone had turned the brightness down to an unnatural level. Couldn't explain it, but it was wrong. And then, as if in response to my thoughts, a figure moved. It was subtle, almost imperceptible at first. A shadow that shifted just above me, lingering at the edge of my vision. A form that shouldn't have been there. My breath caught in my throat as I tried to focus on it. But before I could react, it was gone. Just a fleeting moment, like a dream that slipped through my fingers. I shook my head, forcing myself to focus. It was 6 a.m. now. I had followed the rules. I had made it to the end. But as I stood up, ready to leave, something stopped me. A sound. It was faint, but unmistakable. A soft rustling, like paper shifting in the wind. I turned quickly, my heart pounding, but there was nothing there. The food court was as empty as it had been moments ago. But as I moved to step forward, I felt it again. An unsettling sensation of something not right. I couldn't explain it, but the mall felt different now. It didn't feel like the place I had been working in all these hours. It was quieter, darker, and there was an emptiness to it that pressed down on me, like the space between the walls had expanded, leaving me with nowhere to go. I walked toward the exit, but the door wouldn't open. I pressed my hand against the cold glass, but it didn't budge. I looked over my shoulder, expecting to see someone, anyone, but the hallway behind me was empty. I could hear nothing but my own breath echoing in the silence. Then I heard it, a faint knocking sound from behind the door. Slowly, methodically, the sound of the knocking grew louder with each passing second. It wasn't coming from the door. It was coming from inside the walls, from everywhere. A soft, rhythmic thud, like the pulse of something alive, something that was waiting for me. I pressed my palms against the cold glass, my fingers shaking uncontrollably, and without thinking, I turned the handle. But the door wouldn't budge. It was locked. Panic surged through me. I had to get out. I had followed the rules. I had done everything right. But this was different. This felt like a trap. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the knocking stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating, deafening, and I felt my skin crawl. I didn't wait. I didn't even think. I burst through the exit doors with all my strength, but I could swear it felt like someone was pushing against me. I did it. I had survived. The sun barely peeked over the horizon. The mall loomed behind me, a hollow shell. I didn't look back. Couldn't. Without thinking any further, I went home and never went back to that hellish job again. So if you ever get into a night guard job at Westview Galleria, or any mall with strange rules to follow, please, for the safety of your own life, leave immediately.